Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, pressing forward, China's policymakers convene in Beijing to map out the nation's new five-year plan, with the Chinese economy high on the agenda. And the Chinese ambassador to the U.S., Cui Tiankai, give us an exclusive insider's look on the complexities of China-U.S. relations. We start today's show with China's biggest annual political event, the Two Sessions, which last half months. China and the world are paying close attention to what is going on and what to be discussed as they set the country's direction in politics, economy, defense, and many more.
Kicking into action, members of the National People's Congress and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference have gathered in Beijing. They will discuss the major state policies to be implemented this year and how the world and China can work together towards common growth. For this year, some keywords appearing on social media have been the five-year plan. High on the agenda at this year's Two Sessions is the review and approval of the plan's outline. Economic growth. As always, China's growth target is an important issue, and more so this year with the economic slowdown. Supply-side reform. The government pledged to push a supply-side structural reform in 2016 to support growth through new demand and productivity. Others include real estate market regulation, financial supervision system reforms, the second child policy, anti-corruption and green development. Most of them are economy-related. With 2016 being the first year of the 13th five-year plan, this year's Two Sessions is of particular importance.
The 13th five-year plan is the last one before 2020 to realize China's centennial goals. People attach great attention and a lot of expectation to it, and they hope to get assurance from the plan.
This year, the economy is likely to dominate the agenda. With a focus on how China should implement the 13th five-year plan, supply-side structural reforms and the major tasks of cutting overcapacity and excess inventory, delegates are advising measures to reduce costs and strengthen weak points. And in the next 2 weeks, they will cast their votes on the next move for economic growth and reform.
For more on the Two Sessions and what are on China's agenda, we are joined here in the Beijing studio, Mr. Xiang Zongzuo, who is the Deputy Director of the International Monetary Institute at Renmin University, also Chief Economist of ABC, Agricultural Bank of China. Meanwhile, joining us from Washington, D.C., we got two very influential figures when it comes to analyzing what's going on in China. First of all, in Washington, D.C., we have Mr. Scott Kennedy, who is the Director of the Project on Chinese Business and Political Economy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Meanwhile, also joining us from Washington, we have Mr. Cheng Li, who is a Director and Senior Fellow at John Thornton Center at the Brookings Institution. Welcome to the three of you gentlemen. Of course, this is going to be an interesting discussion. First of all, the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang, he visited the ongoing CPPCC session. In the joint session between the agricultural scholars and experts and the economists, he was talking about the confidence he has toward the Chinese economy. But I want to have your views as well. How much confidence you have and where does it come from? Mr. Xiang?
Well, I think the confidence means, I think, at least the three aspects. First of all, there is still we have enormous opportunity to expand the Chinese economy to investment. For example, there is a new urbanization process, and there is poverty reduction, and there is infrastructure investment. I think all these things need a huge, enormous investments. So for entrepreneur, for domestic as well as foreign investors, they can find opportunities to expand their business. I think that's one fundamental fact for Chinese economy. Second, of course, there is new sectors, and we have many policy options to use. Fiscal policy, I think this year, I think the deficit of the fiscal deficit to GDP ratio will be enhance a little bit more, maybe to 3%, at least 2.5%. That means governments will issue bonds to finance the big projects. So I think that the confidence, like policy, opportunities, and of course we have accumulated so much, wealthy and savings and many other things to use.
We got your point. Fiscal monetary policies and also structural reform.
Yeah.
But the question is, all the potentials are out there. Will people do that, as what Mr. Xiang just described, this to grasp this opportunity? Mr. Kennedy.
I think the two sessions offer what I would see as the best last hope to put meat on the bones of the third plenum decision from 3 years ago. There's obviously a consensus in China that the economy needs to be restructured, that a whole variety of reforms need to be enacted to achieve that, but the implementation over the last several years has been extremely gradual and in some places gone back to some extent. This is a terrific opportunity to move forward rapidly across a number of areas at the same time, and we'll see from the report that Li Keqiang gives at the opening of the NPC tomorrow precisely what their goals are for this year and this session to see if we can actually move forward more quickly than we have in the past 3 years.
Dr. Li, as a political scientist, you know very well about the interlink between politics and economy in this country. Having said that, though, we've seen some different examples in different countries. You know, in the former Soviet Union, they got this shock therapy, which had a huge damage to its own economy and takes decades to recover. And China takes on this reform path. As Mr. Kennedy mentioned earlier, it needs to be gradual, but sometimes cannot be too gradual. So here's the issue of speed, ambition, and agenda. Dr. Li, what do you make of it?
Well, I think that China has been doing much better than many parts of the world, certainly better than Russia. I think Premier addressed the right issue about confidence. We know that there's some real economy, and real economy has some difficulties, but the more problematic is about confidence. I think we need to uplift public confidence and also overseas confidence about China's economy. I think these two sessions actually, also the 13th five-year plan, also emphasize the right things. They talk about green consumption, green development, talk about innovation, talk about inclusiveness. I think these are the three things China really need. I think that we applaud this kind of approach. It's not a single-minded GDP growth as was the previous case, but rather is what the Chinese leaders, Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang, talk about, the quality growth. I think this is the right direction. And yes, the growth rate may not be as high as 9 or 10% as before, but it will be probably somewhere between 6.5 to 7. But that's a very healthy development.
Yes, indeed. You do mention some of the key words coming from the possible government work report, as it was already emphasized by the Chinese government. For example, green development. But Mr. Kennedy, some suggest when the goal of green development was being suggested at the very beginning, Chinese economy was growing at a really fast pace. And meanwhile, the world economy has been recovering from the setback of the 2008 and 9 financial crisis. But now it seems that the speed overall has been slowing down again. And therefore, green development, for example, new innovation, is that too much luxury to talk about? How much will they help us in the short term, Mr. Kennedy?
That's a terrific question, but I think it highlights a contradiction that actually doesn't exist in reality. You don't have to have green development equal slow growth. You actually can have a lot of policies that help the economy grow. And that's really applies not only to conservation or becoming more green and polluting less. It applies to other parts. You don't have to have contraction. Reform and structural reform doesn't necessarily only mean contractionary policies. There's ways to liberalize the economy that also would promote structural reform that would be expansionary, that would be positive, liberalizing services, for example. So I think you can have a greener economy, a more balanced economy, and an economy that grows at a healthy pace, as Li Chung said, not at 9 or 10%, but somewhere between 6 and 7.
Right.
I think that's eminently achievable with the right policies.
I see. There are different views, really, as you all know very well, about Chinese economy and also factors of the Chinese economy. For example, Moody's downgraded recently the outlook of the Chinese government debt to quote-unquote negative from stable on Wednesday, citing uncertainty as they see it over authorities' capacity to implement economic reforms, rising government debt and falling reserves. And yet, earlier on, chiefs of World Bank, IMF, these organizations related to the United Nations played down concern over how Beijing has managed its economic slowdown. Let's listen in.
We think that there are things that are happening here that are very positive from the perspective of the decision that was made to change the drivers of growth. We do see consumption is up. We do see the service industry is now more than half of Chinese GDP.
We don't see a hard landing as a very high probability. The economy continues to grow. It's slowed a little, but it continues to grow. There's a kind of a transition underway. It'll be complicated. It may be a bumpy transition, but it's continuing.
We hope Moody is really not moody, but on the other hand, Mr. Xiang, let me ask you about this. How much, whether inside China or overseas, are we really judging about the Chinese economy with an attitude? Or are we judging the real Chinese economy with statistics, with cool analysis?
Of course, concerning Chinese economy, so huge economy, there's so much different opinions of view on the prospects. On the one hand, we have confidence, of course. On the other hand, we must face the reality, the challenges. Frankly speaking, I at least partly agree with the remarks Mr. Kennedy just mentioned. In these years, many people are worrying about the pace, the speed of a reform. Everything depends on implementation of reform. Frankly speaking, in these years, at least in some fields, the reform has not been implemented so satisfactorily. Even we have disappointment with the implementation.
That's why the
reform.
G20 finance minister, central bank governor,
I want to mention the SOE reform. SOE reform is a key field to stimulate entrepreneurship and to make market-oriented reform everything. But SOE reform, personally, I think we have not made great progress so far. So I wish during the new 5-year period, all these reforms can, proceed very successfully. So that's sources of confidence. If there is no well-balanced or well-implemented reforms, I have a worry about whether we cannot achieve our goals of a new 5-year plan.
Interesting point you made over there, implementation.
Yeah.
Implementation sounds like a word. However, it is so much related to many other things going on in China, which is, for example, economic governance capability and all the other social and political innovations going on in this country. Dr. Li, you are an expert in this field, so let me ask you about this. How can we understand the Chinese version now of the economic governance capability? What exactly, at this stage, the relations, fundamental question, relations between government's role and the role of the market?
Well, it's a good combination, and we should not go to two extremes. One is certainly the previously planned economy, monopoly of state-owned enterprises. To a certain extent, I think that they're already rejected by the top leadership. But China also will not be too naive to privatize all these companies. And also we need to find a balance in terms of what role government should play and play in a positive way. Now, earlier you mentioned about Moody. Moody reflects some conventional wisdom outside China. Sometimes may or may not right. But also the talk about the state-owned enterprises problem is also a conventional wisdom within China, may or may not be right, because Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign already undermined SOEs. You look at the third platform agenda, really talk about private sector development. Now, I would be happy to comment more if we have time about the implementation. And I think that the challenge is anti-corruption undermines this interest group. So you create a problem that in action by SOEs or by local leaders. So I think now China should really promote new leaders who are clean, who are capable, and who are courageous. I think that change the dynamic will be very, very important.
Very significant point you just mentioned. Mr. Kennedy, do you agree with what Dr. Li mentioned, which is we should go to the next stage? Well, the previous stage should continue, which is go against those corruptive officials, but at the same time, discover the new ones and make good use of them to let them shine. The politics going on, the economy getting better. Are we at that stage already?
I think that's the direction people would like to go. I don't think we're there yet. The anti-corruption campaign, yes, it has uncovered a lot of corrupt activities. There's probably a lot less corrupt behavior going on now. I think that's largely out of fear of the consequences as opposed to the establishment of a system which is apolitical, which limits that type of behavior, which provides for transparency. I think that's where we're going to need to get in terms of anti-corruption, so that anti-corruption efforts don't have a negative drag on growth and on the performance of officials. Going back to SOE reform, yes, the general goal is right, and I think Li Cheng is correct that you can't just leap ahead too much and privatize too quickly. But we do need to see, I think markets are looking for a clear signal that the goals of SOE reform in terms of giving greater independent authority to the decision makers who run SOEs, and that they both for on the upside and the downside will be implemented, and that other parts of the economy, private and foreign companies, have access to credit and can compete with SOEs on a more level playing field in more sectors of the economy.
You know, Mr. Xiang, China is already at this stage, second largest economy in the world, even though the quality needs to be improved, but still attracts so much attention. China is evolving international power as well. So everything this country is experiencing might be examined under a microscope. Previously, anything would not drag to too much debate, but here, now, at this stage, it does. So how could China stand up to the expectations of the others and will be able to endure the very up-close examinations, assessments of the others? That's also an interesting question. Economy and also politics and social innovation as well.
Yes, there is two aspects. First of all, is the opening up policy should sustain into the future. We should improve our opening up policies to attract investment technology talents. On the other hand, I think the reforming of governance is the key to stimulate, to promote entrepreneurship. So anti-corruption, just discussed, anti-corruption campaign is necessary, extremely necessary, and so far has been made very successful. So to make the government clear and transparent and responsible. However, looking forward, I think the key issue is how to establish the real rule of law, the governance, and make all levels of government responsible and transparent.
Right.
So I think the key issue is to deregulate the power of every level of government. So far, I do think the Chinese government, every level, local as well as the central government, still control and regulate so many things. And the private capital, every kind of private capital are face so high entry barrier.
Right.
There is implicit barriers, and many kinds of costs. Of course, the central government emphasize we must take measures to reduce the cost of enterprises, but we are still looking forward. How can they implement these measures to reduce the so-called transaction cost for enterprises.
An excellent point. Once again, we're going back to the discussion of implementation. That's what they're talking about. The vision is there, but how
Yeah.
to do it, and whether you have the political will and the
Sure.
courage to take the steps no matter what. Another thing, Dr. Li, I want to have some of your expertise to shine on this. At a very critical and difficult time, which China is facing right now, because China wants to do many things all at the same time, and it has to. Rally the crowd is very important. So everyone, and most of them, at least above the population, share same goals. However, at the same time, in an economy that is having different voices, you certainly have different opinions. So, Dr. Li, the question is how to, at this point, make people understand the eternal goals of the next 5 years, rally the crowd, and let everyone be able to bring out the best of theirs, of their own, so that the whole country can move forward with every individual.
This is an excellent question. I think Yu Zhengsheng in the CPPCC meeting already mentioned China should emphasize the balance between unity and the diversity. Unity is to consolidate the government and the party's leadership, but at the same time should not overlook the need for diversity. Pluralism is in many ways is important for China's development. There's also another dimension between the innovation but also some kind of stability, because innovation-driven economy, I think, requires all kind of openness, like the previous two guests mentioned, that the openness for private sector, openness for foreign companies, but also a certain degree of the political and social openness is also much needed. I think this kind of delicate balance is what China wants to achieve. I'm glad that the Chinese leadership actually emphasized these issues, especially from these two sessions.
And Mr. Kennedy, your view, briefly?
I think the two places I'm going to be looking for over the next 10 days are, one is the 5-year plan. What are the contents of it? How much is it discussed within the different sessions? What type of changes will be made to the plan as a result of the review of the plan by the deputies themselves? The second is the charity law, which is the perfect opportunity to use the enthusiasm of Chinese volunteers, companies, organizations, to address those areas that the society needs that the government can't meet. And this law is extremely important. It's been a long time in drafting and is a critical thing that I think many people will be looking to see.
What are you going to look at, Mr. Xiang?
My bottom line is actually political reform in order to make very delicate balance between government and markets, between central control and diversification, deregulation and regulation. We need diversification. We need deregulation to encourage the entrepreneurship in this very new age.
All right. We see economists has already become political scientists. And what about political scientists? Are you going to be an economist, Dr. Li? Very briefly from you, what are you going to look at?
Absolutely, they're all linked together.
Yes,
I
final words
think
from you.
I hope that I think the Chinese leadership really emphasize the right issues and talk about inclusiveness, talk about the service sector development. I agree with Scott Kennedy that this is, should not be seen as a zero-sum contradiction between growth and also kind of green development. This actually green consumption could help. For example, the public health reform and also public health care is very, very important. It will be a huge market for China's future development. It will reflect the Chinese people's need and all kind of social groups, and at the same time provide a great opportunity to tell the world China remain as one of the largest, maybe the largest market in the next phase of China's development.
We certainly hope inside the Great Hall of People there will be as many enthusiastic debates as we are already having today, right before the opening of the National People's Congress. And for now, I really appreciate the three gentlemen's insights and input. Li Cheng, Scott Kennedy, and Xiang Zongzuo. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you for being with us. Stay with us here on World Insight. We got our final segment coming right up. China's ambassador to the U.S. shed light on the South China Sea and U.S. elections' impact on China-U.S. ties. You're watching World Inside on CCTV News. The biggest challenges China faces appears to be in its neighboring region. Take, for example, the nuclear crisis on the Korean Peninsula and the territorial disputes in the South China Sea. Yet, all of these issues are linked to the complex relations between China and the U.S. Many believe it is only when these two countries work together with shared vision can this world be changed for the better. One man can say this with more certainty than most. Mr. Cui Tiankai, who is the Chinese ambassador to the United States, he is extremely knowledgeable about these complex issues with his previous roles as the Chinese ambassador to Japan, as division head of the Asian department at China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and many others. I talked to him this time on the sideline of the ongoing CPPCC sessions. CPPCC is the abbreviation for China's top political consultative body, of which Ambassador Cui is a member. Before hearing his insights, take a look at this first.
Stirring up tensions. An American naval fleet, spearheaded by the aircraft carrier the USS John C. Stennis, has entered the South China Sea this week. Meanwhile, Washington's close ally Japan has confirmed it will be joining the US and India in a joint exercise this year in waters just northeast of the South China Sea, forming what some believe to be a maritime circle against China. These all come as the US accuses China of pursuing militarization in the South China Sea. China strongly denies the claim, saying it has taken the tough position of protecting its sovereignty in the South China Sea.
China's position on the South China Sea issue is clear and consistent. We firmly safeguard peace, stability and freedom of navigation and overflight in the area all countries are entitled to according to the international law. We hold that all disputes should be settled peacefully through negotiations.
Tensions are escalating and cooperation could become shaky as China and the US, the two major powers on opposite ends of the Pacific Ocean, apparently hold to their differences on the issue. Now more than ever, dialogue and understanding between the two sides is imperative.
It seems, apparently at least for now, US and China have very different vision about the rules and how things should proceed in the future in the region.
South China Sea is not and should not become an issue between China and the United States, because geographically the United States is far away from South China Sea. And the official position of the US government is that the US has no territorial claims in South China Sea and takes no position on the territorial disputes. This is the official position of the United States government. But the problem is that if you watch closely some of the US officials or senior military personnel, if you watch very closely what they are saying or what they are doing, you have the impression that the United States is taking sides, and maybe taking the wrong sides. I think this is a problem. And also on the issue of South China Sea, I think the United States, or maybe some people in the United States, are advocating some of the ideas that are totally not based on facts. For instance, many people in the US are saying that the United States will have to defend the freedom of navigation. But the problem is that the freedom of navigation they are talking about is different from the freedom of navigation that is provided for in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So that's a very different concept. Because when the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea was adopted, the United States could not accept the idea of freedom of navigation. Some people in the US believe that they should have unconditioned, unrestricted freedom anywhere in the world. So that's why they launched what they call freedom of navigation operation. So this operation was actually a challenge to the freedom of navigation as provided for by the convention.
It is not only, Mr. Ambassador, the terminologies that actually should provoke some thoughts, but also what is really behind the very different interpretations of these terminologies. Do you think the two countries likely to be very strategically in conflict on the issue of South China Sea?
Honestly, I'm quite worried about the situation, about possible escalation of the situation in South China Sea. And I'm quite worried by acts by the US military to use their term, to militarize the region or the situation there. You see, the US has sent a lot of military vessels and a lot of military planes to South China Sea, including strategic bombers. This is a clear evidence that some people in the United States are attempting to militarize the situation there. And that will hurt everybody's interest. So we are quite worried and we are opposed to that.
What do you think of all of the actions, or probably reactions coming from China in building up on the South China Sea? And what do you make of others' concern about that?
I think all these accusations against China are not based on facts. Because we have sovereignty over the islands and reefs in South China Sea. But the problem is that some of the other countries, some of our neighbors, over the years have illegally occupied so many of them. I think altogether 42 islands and reefs have been illegally occupied by some other states. And for one of them occupied 29. And they have built military facilities on these islands and reefs, including airstrip, including heavy artillery, and even missiles. So we have to do something to defend our own interests.
But they're saying, well, China, you are such a strong party. I mean, for the other countries, they're in the South China Sea, much smaller country, much economically weaker ones. Can't China just be a big nation and show your attitude as brothers in the region? Why do you have to take away everything that the others want? You're already so strong.
It's really absurd to listen to such argument made by Americans. Look at what the United States have done in the world. It is showing us a good example of how a big power should behave in connection with smaller powers. And besides, what China is doing is just to defend our legitimate interests. We are not invading other countries. We are not taking over islands that belong to other countries. We are not doing that. We always stand for, even for the islands that we strongly believe it's ours, we have sovereignty over them. But if others have disputes, we still stand for bilateral negotiation with them. In fact, we have resolved the border issue with most of our neighbors on the land through bilateral negotiation, and we are ready to do the same on the sea. But we cannot just sit here and do nothing if others continue to occupy our islands and reefs. We have to do something to defend ourselves. If others are not provoking, they have nothing to worry about.
The situation has been tense in the South China Sea after recent moves by the US. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, the competition has been getting intense as the US presidential race campaigns kick into full gear. Democrat Hillary Clinton and Republican Donald Trump in the US rolled up a series of wins on Super Tuesday, the biggest day of primary voting for 2016 US presidential campaign. While many regard it as a domestic issue in the US, some have expressed concerns on how this will shape the future US foreign diplomacy, especially its ties with China. However, it seems most candidates, both Republicans and Democrats, are expressing eagerness to compete with China economically. Donald Trump is campaigning to make America great again, saying the US is incurring a huge trade deficit with China of about $500 billion a year. Hillary Clinton has also accused China, Japan and other Asian economies of manipulating prices for years by holding down the values of their currencies.
It has always been the show time. When is going to be the policy time for the candidates?
Well, maybe it's not my observation, but I can share with you some of the observations made by my American friends. For instance, a very good friend of mine who is also a very senior person in the American media, he believes that during the campaign it's politics. When somebody is actually sitting in the White House, it's a matter of policy. And another American friend told us that for the campaign it's poems. When you are sitting in the White House, it's prose.
That's a very interesting analogy. But at the same time, What do you make of some of the candidates' remarks toward China, mainly bashing at this moment? Is China still going to be the victim of the U.S. presidential race?
Well, you see, the presidential election and the campaign is basically domestic politics of the United States. So we don't want to have anything to do with it. And I just hope that this play of domestic politics will not affect China-US relations in a very negative way. Of course, maybe some of them have the habit of bashing other countries, not only China. They're also bashing, for instance, Mexico, Muslim countries, and a lot of others. But basically, I think what the American people are interested in is their own life, their own economy, opportunities for themselves. So that's why we believe this is basically a domestic issue for the United States.
Should China play a role in communicating with some of the important candidates, helping them to understand what China has in mind and helping them to formulate what they might have in mind for China and U.S. relations in the future?
Yeah, I think we should do that because there's so much at stake for this relationship. We have to work together to manage this relationship in a very positive and productive way. A number of very senior American friends told me, senior in terms of their political position or of their seniority, and some of them used to be very high-ranking officials in the government, and others are still working for important think tanks. So they are the so-called opinion leaders in the United States. And they told me that the world, globally, the world is faced with increasing disorder. And they are worried about that. And they believe China and the United States should work together to respond to such growing disorder. And this is our responsibility. I do share their views. I think that's why we have to take a global perspective. We have to put our relationship in the global perspective and realize that our two great countries have to work together to make the world more stable, more prosperous. This will not only serve the national interests of China and the United States, but also this is our shared responsibility to the global community.
What is it like for you as a communicator, as a go-betweener between these two countries, to make your points heard, not only through the ears, but also going to the heart and mind?
Yeah, this is a very big challenge, of course, especially when the two great countries have so much interaction with each other, and the two countries have so different historical heritage, so different culture, very different political system, and at very different levels of economic development. So it's not easy to have mutual understanding. But mutual understanding and mutual confidence is the foundation for good, constructive, and a positive relationship. So as a diplomat, we have to do our best for that, but we cannot achieve this goal all by ourselves. We need the support of the general public of both countries, and maybe especially the media.
Really appreciate Ambassador Cui. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. It's always my pleasure.
Ambassador Cui Tiankai, who is a Chinese ambassador to the United States, talking to the media. And that's all we have for today. If you'd like to see more of our program, go and visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You'll be able to find us, or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone at the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time, next week, for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night, and have a great weekend.